أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الخلق والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers and sisters, we continue on with our Ramadan evening khatira. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from us our fasting, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that inshallah there is benefit in these short talks for you. They are short, but inshallah there is a small message each night, inshallah. And the theme for the month is the Muslim family. I want to talk today a little bit about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and how he, I spoke in an earlier talk about how he loved the children. But the children don't stay children forever. They ultimately grow up a little bit and they become youth and then teenagers. And the Prophet ﷺ had a lot of respect for the youth. And I really chose that word carefully because when I look at how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with the youngsters, I find that it's nothing but respect. And even when they made mistakes, even when he was trying to teach them something, he did it in a manner that maintained their dignity and maintained their respect. And it really hurts me dearly when we see young Muslims come to the masjid. I know the masjids have been closed now for almost a year, but inshallah they're opening up again. When youngsters come to the masjid and we don't respect them. We don't treat them as equals. We don't dignify them. We almost treat them like little children. We either ignore them or we treat them like children. And that's truly sad because the Prophet ﷺ never did that. And I'm going to share with you tonight some evidence of that from the historical record of the Prophet ﷺ. It's narrated in Al-Bukhari and Muslim by Umar ibn Abi Salama. Umar ibn Abi Salama was a young boy during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And he said, one time I was eating with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. First of all, I find it amazing that the Prophet sallallahu was sitting down with the young boys and he was eating with them. He showed them that tells you right there that he actually respected them. He didn't ignore them. He didn't treat them like, oh, you're just young kids. I want to only sit with the older folk. No, he included the young in any sitting that he was sitting in, and this was a dinner, and he said, I was a young boy with Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the way the food was at that particular dinner is that it was one big dish, and each person would eat from what's close to them. They would eat from it, and he said, كانت يدي تطيش في الصحفة. He said, my hand was all over the place, so it wasn't just in the area of the big dish that was close to me, but I was reaching over and reaching around, and there were other people sitting there eating dinner, and that is impolite. It's not the proper etiquette of the Islamic way of eating. The Prophet ﷺ looked at him and he said, Ya ghulam. So first thing that I notice when I read this is he addressed him. He didn't just yell at him and said, hey, what are you doing? He said he caught his attention and he used a word that's respectful. He said, Ya ghulam. Oh, young boy. That's what it means. Oh, young boy. He didn't say, hey, you. No, he didn't do that. He said, Ya ghulam. He said, Sammillah. So the first thing he told him, say Bismillah before you start your hand all over the dish. First thing you have to do is say Bismillah. And then he said to him, وَكُلْ بِيَمِينَكَ, and eat with your right hand. He had both hands all over the dish. He said, no, eat with your right hand. And then he said, وَكُلْ مِمَّا يَلِيكَ. This is now the teaching point. So first he addresses him. Then he tells him, Sammillah. He reminds him of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he reminds him of the habit of the Muslim, which is to use our right hand in almost everything we do, except in the restroom. He says, eat with your right hand, and then eat from that portion which is close to you. Kul mimma yalik. Eat from what is in front of you. Don't overreach. That people don't like to see that. They don't want to see your hand all over the dish because they're going to eat from that side of it. Subhanallah. Now Umar ibn Abi Salama, he is the one who's narrating the hadith. So it's not that someone else was watching or that Rasulullah ﷺ told someone later. He himself, which really tells you after he became an adult, he started to narrate this hadith. So that tells you how much the impact of the respectful nature of Rasulullah ﷺ was on this young man. It actually had a tremendous impact that he carried on later in life. And that's really the point. If we respect the young, if we really want them to understand our point of view, to understand right from wrong, we have to teach it to them respectfully. We have to teach it to them with dignity. We have to treat them like human beings. We have to treat them like the young adults that they are soon going to become. Al-Bukhari radiallahu anhu narrates a hadith on Sahl ibn Sa'd. He said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was sitting in the masjid with a group of people, and amongst them was a young man. And I'm going to tell you the name of that man at the end of the story, because that's how the narration is. They tell us the name at the end of the story. But there was a young man sitting next to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Subhanallah. Now, what happened was that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam had a container with some, I don't know if it was water or juice. They don't say it. They just say sharab. There was something. He was drinking something from that container. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he drank from it. And then he wanted to share it with anyone who was interested in drinking. Now, most of the people who were there were of the age of Rasulullah ﷺ or perhaps older. So they were not youngsters. But this particular young man was sitting next to the Prophet ﷺ. So he looked to him. He looked at him. Now he was sitting to the right of the Prophet ﷺ. And he said to him, I mean, when I read this, it's astounding to me. He said to him, أَتَأْذَنُ لِي أَنْ أُعْطِيَ هَؤُلَاءِ. Will you give me permission? Rasulullah ﷺ is asking the young man, the young boy sitting next to him. He said, will you give me permission to share it with the elderly first? Subhanallah. Why? Because he's sitting to his right. So he has the right of first dibs on whatever he's drinking. He said, will you give me permission to share it with the elderly first? The young boy said, no, I don't give you permission. SubhanAllah, can you imagine the courage of that young boy? And Rasulullah ﷺ was taken aback. He didn't expect that answer from the young boy, but he did not yell at him. He just simply looked at him, just waiting for an explanation. I mean, why are you saying no? He said, no, I won't let anyone have the good fortune of drinking right after you other than myself. Subhanallah. That young boy wanted the blessings of Rasulullah. That Rasulullah had just drank from that container. He wanted to be the next one to get the blessing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when he heard his explanation, he immediately gave him the container. Subhanallah. He did not say no and argue with him and no, you should respect the elderly first. No. You know, how can you argue with that? I mean, it's so powerful. His argument is so strong and so powerful. You cannot say no. So he immediately gave it to him. That young man is Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiyallahu anhuma. Abdullah ibn Abbas, who would later become the great interpreter of the Quran. Perhaps the Sahabi who understood the Quran more than anyone else. Part of the respect of children is to treat them equally, to treat them fairly. When you start to favor one child upon another, that's a problem. Because that means you're respecting one child more than the other. That means you value one child more than the other. Rasulullah ﷺ was absolutely against that. Al-Bukhari radiallahu anhu narrates to us that Al-Nu'man ibn Bashir narrates that his father came to him to Rasulullah ﷺ. He brought his son Al-Nu'man to Rasulullah ﷺ when he was a young boy. And he said to Rasulullah ﷺ, he said, I gave this son of mine, I gave him some property. So he had property and he gave his son. He said, I'm going to give it to my son. And I want you to bless it. He wants Rasulullah ﷺ to be a witness that he is giving this particular property to this boy. And he wants the blessings of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam looked at him and said, did you do this for all of your children? In other words, you gave him. What about the other kids? He said, no, I did not. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, ittaqullah wa'dilu fi awladikum. Beware of Allah and be just with your children. Be fair to your children. And then he said to him, La ashhadu ala jur. I will not be a witness to a transgression. I won't. This is not right. I won't do it. And you might think to yourself, well, this is a big deal. I mean, this is property and it's worth a lot of money. But no. The justice and fairness was even in something much simpler than that. Anas radiallahu anhu narrates that a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he was sitting and talking with the Prophet ﷺ. So they were in the masjid and this man had some issue that he wanted to consult with Rasulullah ﷺ about, and he started to talk to him. And while he was doing that, his young son came in to the masjid. And he ran towards his father. He saw his father and he rushed towards him. So he had the son sit on his right lap. He had on his lap, sat close to him. A few minutes later, the daughter runs into the masjid. His young daughter, she runs into the masjid, and she runs towards her father. So he had her sit on the floor in front of him. He didn't put her on his lap. Rasulullah ﷺ looked and he said, I really think you should treat them the same. You should put her on your lap the same way you put your son on your lap. Subhanallah. He gave this man advice to do that. So it's not just because that other one was property. No, it's the principle of the matter. We should be treating our children with equity, with fairness, with justice, from when they are little children until they are much older. That has no limits, and it doesn't matter what it is you are doing. The Prophet ﷺ was exemplary teacher for the young. One time a young man came to him, and in the narration, it's narrated in Musnad al-Imam Ahmad, عن أبي أمامة رضي الله عنه, he said that a young man, he said, though in Arabic he said غلاما شابا, meaning he was a youngster, he was a youth, so he wasn't an older person, he was under the age of 20, and he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Now the problem is, at that age, emotions are hot, hormones are raging, and there's a lot of sexual thoughts. And this man came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he sat in front of him, and there were other people. And he said, Ya Rasulullah, إِذَنْ لِي فِي الزِّنَا. Just like that. He said, Rasulullah, give me permission to go and have a sexual relation with a woman who's not his wife. He wants to have a haram relation. In Islam, it's not permissible to have any relationship outside of marriage, whether it's premarital or after marriage. It's not permitted. You can only have a sexual relation with your wife that you have married according to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And here is this man coming asking for permission to fornicate. Astaghfirullah, how could somebody... Imagine today if someone came and said that to an imam or anyone. They would yell at him. They would, how dare you ask me that question? Of course it's haram. But that's not what Rasulullah ﷺ did. In fact, the narration said, فَصَاحَ النَّاسُ بِهِ. The people started yelling at him. How can you ask Rasulullah ﷺ this kind of question? People were yelling at the young man. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said to the people, he said, قَرِّبُوهُ. SubhanAllah, that choice of words. قَرِّبُوهُ means bring him close to me. SubhanAllah. The people are yelling at this young man, and Rasulullah says, bring him close to me. So they let him come closer to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and he looked at the young man and he said, Udnu, come close to me, come down to me, and sit next to me. Subhanallah. He had him sit right next to him. See, that's respect. When you respect people, they listen to you. But when you yell at them, they don't. You could yell as loud as you want, but they don't hear you. They don't hear you because they've already tuned you out. They know you're negative. You're not going to teach them anything. But when you're calm, when you have something to say, they will listen to you. Yes, I know it's hard because sometimes your emotions are boiling inside. But this is what we have to learn from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He sat next to him and he looked at this young man and he hit him hard with just 2 words. There's nothing more loving to a man than his mother. Every man loves his mother. Every person loves his mother. He looked at him and he said, would you accept it for your mom? أتحبه لأمك. He didn't say sister first. He said mom. Would you like it for your mom? Would you like for your mom to be involved in an illicit sexual relation that is haram? To have a premarital affair? The young man said, no, of course not. He said, similarly, other people don't like it for their mothers. He said, would you like it for your sister? He said, no. He said, similarly, other people would not like for their sisters to be involved in an illicit relationship with you. He said, if you had a daughter, would you like it for your daughter? He said, no, of course not. Of course, he's young, he doesn't have a daughter yet. He said, of course not. He said, similarly, others don't like it for their daughter. And then he mentioned the ants, subhanallah. And then every time he would mention a category, the man would say, no, of course not, I would not want it. And then Rasulullah ﷺ put his hand on his chest. You see, that's a loving gesture. He put his hand on his chest and he made a dua for him. He said, Allahumma tahhir qalba, waghfir dhanba, wa hassin farja. Oh Allah, purify his heart and forgive his sin and protect his private parts. He made a dua. Simple dua, it's very simple, but it's a beautiful dua. Purify his heart, forgive his sin. He's been looking, right? And then protect his private parts. The man stood up and he said, from that moment on, there was nothing that I hated more in this world than to have a sexual relation with a woman other than my wife. Subhanallah. That's the kind of teaching that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam gave to others. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was praying in the masjid in Jama'ah. And they were praying, and standing there in amongst the Jama'ah was a young man. He was new to Islam. He had just accepted Islam recently. So he didn't know all the rules of Jama'ah prayer. And while they were praying in Jama'ah, one of the people who was standing in the line sneezed. So when he sneezed, this young man, he had learned that in Islam, when somebody sneezes, you say, Alhamdulillah, may Allah have mercy upon you. So when he heard the other man sneeze, this is during the salah, it's actually in the prayer. And he looks and he says, Yarhamukallah. Subhanallah. And then this young man, he's narrating the story, he said, فَرَمَانِ الْقَوْمُ بِأَبْصَارِهِمْ. The people who were standing there, they were looking at me, but he didn't say they were looking at me. He said they were throwing their looks at me. Subhanallah, can you imagine? I mean, they're darting me with their looks. Subhanallah. He said, so I said, what's wrong? So he started asking me, why are you looking at me? What's wrong? Why are you looking at me? مَا شَأْنُكُمْ تَنْظُرُونَ إِلَيْهِ. What's wrong with you folks? Why are you looking at me? So now they were even more upset. He continues to talk during the prayer. So they took their hands and they started to pat their hands on their thighs, trying to make a sound to just quiet him down. Calm down, stop talking. He said, then we finished the prayer. And after we finished the prayer, the Prophet ﷺ, he asked me to come close to him. And then he said, my dear son, Ya Bunay, this salah is sacred. The usual talk of people is not appropriate during salah. لا يصلح فيها شيء من كلام الناس. The regular talk is not appropriate for salah. But salah is tasbih, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, and takbir, Allahu Akbar, and qira'atul Quran, and the reading of Quran. This young man said, ما رأيت معلما قبله ولا بعده أحسن تعليما منه فوالله ما قهرني ولا ضربني ولا شتمني. He said, I never in my life either before this incident or after this incident, have I seen a teacher as good as Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And then he said, by Allah, he did not belittle me, he did not hit me, and he did not yell at me or insult me. Subhanallah. Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu his mother wanted him to learn from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when he was a young boy, she brought him to the house of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was kind of employed as a servant of Rasulullah. He was not a slave, but he was a servant, khadim. He was a servant of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Anas said, during my years in the house of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he never asked me, why did you do this? Or why did you not do that? He never yelled at me. He never even frowned at me. وَلَا عَبَسَ فِي وَجْهِي. He never even frowned at me. Subhanallah. This is the beautiful nature of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and how he was able to capture the love of the young and to capture their attention and to really very carefully and very beautifully make them listen to his advice and to his teachings. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.